People who haven't spent a lot of time with different languages sometimes think that learning a new language is mostly about relabeling the world with new words. This mentality is especially bad when translating to Chinese from another language. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about translation. As frequent listeners should know, I run monthly challenges over at challenges.hackingchinese.com, where you set a goal for a 3-week period and you try to learn a little bit more Chinese than you normally do. And in October, the focus of the challenge is translation, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about that a little bit. As usual, if you listen to this later, you can just head over to Hacking Chinese Challenges and check what challenges are on the front page. So I've taught a fair amount of translation, and when I say translation in this case, and I mean that in this episode in general, I'm not talking about professional translation, I'm not talking about translating novels or legal documents or anything like that. I'm just talking about the activity of taking content in one language and translating it into another language. That might be for practice purposes or because you need that text in the other language. Translation is a natural part of learning a new language because we will always run into things we know how to say in one language and now we want to be able to say this thing in the new language. Of course, we don't always think in words in one language and everything we do in Chinese doesn't need to be translation, of course. For example, if I feel hungry, there is no need to formulate a sentence, I am hungry, and then think to myself, how do I say this in Chinese? Not even a beginner needs to do that. You just think about, okay, I have this emotion here, and how do I say that in Chinese? And indeed, a goal for many beginners should be to translate as little as possible, because, as we shall see, the closer you stay to English, the worse your Chinese will get. I want to present a method for translating, which works for both beginners and more advanced students, that helps you avoid translating on a superficial level, which is a huge problem because both beginners and more advanced students often produce sentences in Chinese that are more English-like than they need to be. And this often comes back to the attitude I talked about in the introduction about thinking of language learning as a relabeling process, whereas in fact it is much deeper than that. I should also note that modern language pedagogy has of course moved away from translation a long time ago. It used to be that people who learned languages only did translations, and if you learned, say, Latin or Greek, you studied texts in those languages, usually classical texts, and then you spent most of your time translating them into your native language, looking at the grammar, the words, and so on. And that was basically what learning a language was, at least in an academic setting. Like I said, modern theories of second language acquisition don't really look at translation very favorably, and indeed in many curricula there isn't any translation at all, and we also of course have lots of schools that advocate using only the target language 100%, or at least to a very large extent. And this is mostly for the good, of course. That doesn't mean, though, that translation is harmful. It just means that if you want to be able to communicate in the language and use it in the real world, obviously you cannot spend all your time reading classical texts and figuring out how to translate them best into your native language. That kind of goes without saying. An interesting thing to note, though, is that the new HSK 3.0, which we talked about in episode 47, actually does specify standards for translation. So to summarize, translation is something that all of us do, and sometimes it is extremely useful, and it can also be part of various tasks, including real-life ones at work or for educational purposes. And we need to be able to translate, even though, of course, we shouldn't use it as our main method of learning a language. So then the question is, how do you translate without making your Chinese sound like English with Chinese words? The key insight here is that you need to ignore the surface level to a much higher extent than most students do. And that means that you shouldn't care too much about the wording in the English sentence or how it is structured, but instead you should try to get at the underlying meaning. What do these concepts mean? What does the sentence try to convey? And things like that. You don't care about what words are used and how they are arranged. So instead of taking a superficial form, the written text in English, and directly trying to write that in Chinese, which would then be another superficial level, you try to go one level down to a deeper level, to concepts and ideas and meaning, and you try to translate on that level to Chinese, and then you try to phrase a sentence in Chinese that makes sense. And then, of course, at the very end, you need to verify that your Chinese sentence actually matches the meaning of the original English sentence. Otherwise, you can't really be claiming to translate. But the main point is that these sentences will look very different. It simply doesn't work to translate on a word level, and you cannot stick too close to the English sentence and write good Chinese at the same time. And the point of translation, regardless of if it is for practice purposes or professional purposes or whatever, is to produce a version in the target language that sounds natural in that language and conveys the same thing. It will never be the same, but it can come as close as possible. I will now go through a 6-step process for how to make better translations in Chinese and how to learn more along the way. And if you want to have a visual overview of this, you can as usual look at the written article on Hacking Chinese that contains a nice diagram. This method might seem a little bit too elaborate for some, and indeed it is. You can often skip certain steps, and once you're familiar with how it works and have done lots of translations, you will be able to do some of them so quickly that you probably don't even notice. So we're going to start with a simple sentence that would be suitable for beginners, and it is, "The apples I bought yesterday are very tasty." So how would we go about translating this into good Chinese? And what most people do, especially beginners, is that they simply look at the words, they look them up, and then if you're really unlucky, they just put them next to each other in the same order as in English, i.e. just relabel everything in the sentence, and then they think that they have a good sentence in Chinese, which is of course not true. Word-by-word translations can work sometimes between other languages, but between Chinese and English, they almost never do. So the first step is to split the sentence into easier components. And here we have at least 2 identifiable chunks. One is the apples I bought yesterday, and the other one is are very tasty. So we have a topic and we have something that we want to say about it. By dealing with these separately, we can reduce the complexity of the task, because the sentence is quite long for a beginner to translate, and you might not know how to deal with that. So just don't. Just split it into 2 and deal with them separately, and then try to figure out how to phrase that in Chinese later. The second step is to peel away anything that isn't strictly necessary for the meaning, and these are usually grammar things in English that don't really have to be there. So we can convert the apples I bought yesterday to apple I buy yesterday. Chinese doesn't have any tense anyway, and we don't deal with plurals the same way and so on. So the underlying concepts here are simply apple, I, buy, and yesterday. Those things we can't really get rid of because that's kind of the core of the meaning in that sentence. In step 3, we actually try to translate to Chinese. So notice we didn't take the superficial sentence and try to translate it into Chinese immediately. Instead, we went down to this underlying level of meaning. So we're looking at the concepts. What do they mean? What do they convey? And then we see how can we express those things in Chinese, still at a very basic level. So apple would be 苹果, and I would be 我, and buy would be 买, and yesterday would be 昨天. So please remember that we are on this deeper level here. This is not a sentence, you're just dealing with concepts, so you can't just read these together. That would indeed create a sentence that is completely wrong in Chinese and would be mostly incomprehensible. If you do this as a teacher with students, or indeed if you're a student yourself and you want to do it properly, you can actually write these down on pieces of paper. So you have the words on pieces of paper you can move around. And that will allow you to think of them as concepts rather than part of a string that has to be in that order, because, well, that's the way it was in the original. So if you have them as pieces of paper, or indeed if you have them in a text editor or whatever, you can then scramble the order. That's step number 4, scramble the order. And that is to make sure you're one step removed from the English original. You should no longer think of this, so just scrambling the word order here gets you away from that. So step number 5 is to rearrange the concepts or words into a pattern that makes sense in Chinese based on what you know about sentence structure, how to express things in Chinese. Now, we know that the time when something happens should probably be at the beginning of the sentence, either before or after the subject. So we should say 我昨天买. And of course, we know that we are describing apples here, so all this is just a description of the apples to specify what they are, and in Chinese we use 的 to do this. So 我昨天买的苹果. In this step, you might also need to add or remove certain words that don't make sense in Chinese. For example, we added de here, which doesn't have a direct correspondence in English, or you might have to add a preposition or remove an article or something like that. There are lots of things you might have to do here to express something in Chinese. If we were to take another example and say a sentence that contains the word windy in English, as in today it's windy outside, in Chinese this is usually just 风很大. And obviously we don't say that the wind is big in English, so if you have something like this, you do need to express things the way they would be expressed in Chinese. And obviously that is sometimes hard to know, but that's something you will learn over time. The more you listen, the more you read, the better you will be at figuring things like this out. And of course, there are also dictionaries that you can check these things out in. But note the difference between looking something up in a dictionary at this point, rather than just taking the original sentence, looking each word up and then trying to build a sentence in Chinese that way, because that will lead to much more errors and weirder sentences. Finally, since we started out by splitting the sentence into two, we now also need to do the same thing with the other part of the sentence. And then we of course need to recombine them into a whole here at the end. But that second bit is pretty easy, because are very tasty would just be 非常好吃, so we can just add that at the end, and it's not a problem. This step, though, when you're dealing with longer text or more complicated content, can be very hard, and you should also remember that there is nothing that requires you to stick to the same sentence length as the original in English, because while punctuation works mostly the same way in English and Chinese, sentence length certainly doesn't, and there's nothing that says that just because there is a comma here or a period here in English, it has to be one in Chinese. That won't work. So if something works well as one sentence in English, maybe you need two in Chinese. Or the opposite, which is rather more common, where you have several sentences in English, whereas you would just have commas in Chinese. Like I said earlier, this process might look a little bit too complicated, and I'm not saying that you should use this every time you translate something, but I think it's a good place to start because it forces you to go away from the superficial form of the original sentence and try to translate that too directly. I've read way too many student sentences and essays and reports where it's abundantly clear that the student did not do this. They simply took the original sentence and tried to write it in Chinese immediately. And of course, if you're very good at Chinese, you can do that, but for most students, that doesn't really work. Another advantage with this level is that if you think about it, the second step here is actually the same as if you were writing these sentences from scratch or saying them. So you're starting with concepts and ideas. These are the things that I want to say, and then you express them in Chinese according to the rules of grammar and how vocabulary works and so on and so forth. Whereas if you translate directly, you're not starting with these basic concepts. You're starting with a fully formed sentence in English and thinking about how to express that in another language. And that is actually not what you want to do when you speak or write normally. You definitely want to start with the ideas and concepts and thinking about how to say them. So going through this process allows you to practice that to a higher degree than direct translation would. If you found this interesting and want to have a go yourself, I have provided 3 extra sentences in English and a step-by-step translation of each of them where I go through this process for each of the 3 sentences and end up with a sentence in Chinese at the end. So go and check that out if you are interested. I would also like to recommend 2 articles on Hacking Chinese, one about translating from your native language to Chinese, which is what we talked about now and why that might be useful, and another article which talks about the opposite direction, i.e. translating from Chinese to your native language and why that might be a useful learning method. And I've put links to both those articles in the description of this episode. That's it for today. Head over to Hacking Chinese Challenges and sign up for the translation challenge, and I'll see you there. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.